Hello, PHILO-notes friends. Welcome back for another edition of our daily whiteboard. In this edition, I will briefly sketch Martin Heidegger's existential philosophy. It must be noted that Heidegger is a huge philosopher and difficult to understand. Thus, I will only present the key concepts of Heidegger's existential philosophy. To begin with, it is important to note that Heidegger offers a new conception of philosophy, which, according to some scholars such as Werner Marx, aims ultimately to attain a second beginning at this late stage or 20th century of human development. Thus, Heidegger's effort must be seen as composing in a new different way the question concerning the essence of being, and at one with this, articulating the essence of man. It appears therefore that Heidegger's main intention in rekindling the question concerning the essence of being is to really articulate the essence and meaning of being human. But why the second beginning of philosophy and the task of composing anew the essence of being and the essence of man? For Heidegger, this question has long been stalemated, and yet the question of being, that is, the essence of being and the essence of man, remains the original question. Indeed, it is the first question concerning the meaning of our own being, that is, the meaning of being human, vis-a-vis the meaning of being, that is, being in general or the entirety of nature. The attempt to rekindle the question of being implies, for Heidegger, not only a going back, that is, remembering the original question and appropriating what this serious question itself had revealed to human beings or Dasein, but also a going back to those thinkers who first raised the question concerning the being of beings, that is, the pre-socratics. In other words, for Heidegger, if we want to understand the essence of being, then we need to revisit the pre-Socratic philosophers and know what they said about being. As is well known, the pre-Socratics were the first to raise the question concerning the essence of being and of man. Thus, they were referred to as the first philosophers. With this, they were said to have set the first beginning of philosophy. We must note, however, that the term pre-Socratics does not refer only to the set of philosophers from Thales to the Sophists, for example, Protagoras, Gorgias, and Thrasymachos, but also to the philomathoi, that is, the lovers of myth, like Hesiod and Homer, as Aristotle would call them. Thus, in this context, philosophy could be said to have begun with the philomathoi and the pre-Socratics. Now, let me briefly explain the difference between the philomathoi and the pre-Socratics' way of philosophizing. On the one hand, the philomathoi addressed the question concerning being through their mythical songs. According to Werner Marx, through the mythical songs of the philomathoi, the great and terrifying powers that formed and ruled the cosmos came to light and shone forth in the brilliance of the beautiful and the terror of the numinous. In other words, the philomathoi explained the meaning of being, that is, the entirety of nature, through mythical songs and poems. If it helps, we have to remember that the ancient people, the philomathoi and the pre-Socratics in this case, found the cosmos or nature to be mysterious. For example, it's difficult for the ancient people to make sense of darkness, lightning, the four seasons, and the like. But as records show, they attempted to explain the mysteriousness of these phenomena, and in doing so, the philomathoi used their mythical songs and poems. Concrete example to this is the Genesis, the first part of the Bible. As we know, the authors of the Genesis explain the origin and development of the world through myth. It is interesting to note that during this time, Myth is the best available method in explaining the mysteriousness of the world. It is also important to note that, in and through the simplicity and immediacy of the speech, that is, the saying and singing of the philomathoi, a whole meaningful order arose out of the darkness that had shrouded all that is, or being. In other words, it is through their mythical songs and poems that the philomathoi was able to make sense of the mysteriousness of the world. Lastly, the philomathoi in awe and wonder felt themselves as simply servants or instruments or voices of the powers about which they sang. In other words, the philomathoi believed that they were simply recipients of thoughts or knowledge, that they did not invent thoughts. Instead, thoughts or knowledge were simply revealed to them. As we can see later, this is the basis of Heidegger's famous line, "We do not come to thoughts. Thoughts come to us." The pre-Socratics, on the other hand, addressed the question concerning being through reason. Hence, it was with the pre-Socratics that reason was first used in thinking of the mysteriousness of the world. For Heidegger, the thinking of the pre-Socratics was simple, immediate, and poetic, that is, creative. Hence, for Heidegger, the thinking of the pre-Socratics is a thinking of and toward that which enables, empowers, and forms all that is. That is, the thinking of and toward the logos or underlying principle of the world. Like the philomathoi, the pre-Socratic thinkers felt themselves as servants, instruments, and voices of that power they deserved most, that is, of nous, the light-giving reason. Blessed with the nous or light-giving reason, the pre-Socratic thinkers were gifted with noesis, that is, the capacity to apprehend intuitively and thereby to bring the meaning of reason into the fullness of its light. And through these elucidations, the cosmos become more lucid. Now, it must be noted that the pre-Socratics did not try to elucidate the various meanings of all the many particular beings. Instead, they tried to understand the meaning of being holistically. Hence, the pre-Socratics most of all attempted to understand the entirety of nature through the conception of the phenomenal elementary powers of nature, the elements of water, fire, air, and earth. And in doing so, the pre-Socratics attempted to let emerge that which held all these elements together and empowered them, namely physis, that is, the natureness of nature. For the pre-Socratics, physis is the great unifying mother and is conceived as ion, or to ainai, that is, being or to be. This is because the way physis unfolds itself was seen by the pre-Socratics as the way being unfolds itself, or the way being allows the physi onta, the natural beings, to be or not to be. In this way, physis is understood as that which allows being to make itself appear, but in the act of appearing, being passes again into darkness of their past. Again, as we can see later, this is the basis of Heidegger's famous claim that the moment being reveals itself, it automatically withdraws itself. Indeed, in their philosophizing poems, the pre-Socratics elucidated poetically a certain essence of being, and at one with the essence of being, the essence of man was poetically composed as that natural being that can think the essence of being. Put differently, as Heidegger sees it, through the thinking of the pre-Socratics we are able to make sense of the mysteriousness of nature. And part of this understanding is the realization that, indeed, man, which Heidegger calls Dasein, has the capability of understanding reality. This discussion provides the context of Heidegger's existential philosophy and the reason why Heidegger appropriated the thinking of the pre-Socratics in making sense of the meaning of being. As Werner Marx writes, it is therefore not surprising to find, in analyzing the writings of Heidegger, that his new conception of philosophy seems to demand that the understanding of the philosopher be changed to the kind of self-understanding which the pre-Socratics had. That is, that the new philosopher feel himself again as intermediary, instrument, and voice, and the style of philosophizing again becomes simple, immediate, and poetic, like the singing and thinking of the pre-Socratics. And finally, Heidegger, as the first thinkers did, now sees the foremost task or subject matter of philosophy not as the explanation of the meaning of particular beings, but as the elucidation, articulation, and poetic composition of a new essence of being, and thereby of a new essence of man. Now, at this point, I need to briefly present the key intuition of Heidegger's brand of metaphysics, because we cannot fully understand Heidegger's existential philosophy without understanding the key intuition of his metaphysics. It must be noted that Heidegger rejects the whole enterprise of metaphysics in the traditional sense of this word, where it indicates something eternal, infinite, and perfect. Heidegger's metaphysics is a finite metaphysics of finiteness. What Heidegger calls metaphysics, therefore, is bound up with the structure of man's finite existence in the world. And so, Heidegger proposes to understand man's being in particular and being in general within the horizon of time. Thus, the idea of going beyond time and coming back to time, that is, transcendence, is a misunderstanding of Heidegger. Transcendence for Heidegger is transcendence within immanence, that is to say, transcendence within time. Again, the point of Heidegger's metaphysics is that the meaning of being in general and the meaning of man's existence should be understood in the context of time. There is no outside of time for Heidegger. And this is one of the proper angles in understanding Heidegger's existential philosophy. Thus, for Heidegger, man or Dasein transcends itself but not toward a perfect being, like God of Kierkegaard and Jaspers. Man transcends itself toward its own world and nothing else. We can fully understand this concept once we have understood the key concepts of Heidegger's existential philosophy, namely, his concepts of facticity and deliverance, overtness and world, and the problem of authenticity and inauthenticity. The result of Heidegger's inquiry into the meaning of being, that is, existential phenomenology, is that Dasein is being there in the world, and that it has come to be in the world through deliverance or thrownness, to use Heidegger's word. And Heidegger says, Dasein is thrown into the world, and that being in the world is a thrownness. Heidegger writes, this characteristic of Dasein's being, this that it is veiled in its whence and whither, yet disclosed in itself all the more unveiledly. We call it the thrownness of this entity into its there. Indeed, it is thrown in such a way that, as being in the world, it is the there. The expression thrownness is meant to suggest the facticity of its being delivered over. For Heidegger, this thrownness into the world necessarily implies that Dasein always exists with other entities in the world, and hence, as a being with others in the world, Dasein is entirely submerged in the immediate care and concern of the everyday world into which it is thrown. Evidently, being with others in the world suggests that the existence of Dasein in the world is an existence with the they, or das Man, or the anonymous anyone. Thus, when Heidegger says that Dasein is submerged in the immediate care and concern of the everyday world into which it is thrown, this means that Dasein is constantly related to other human beings in the form of concern and care. As a thrown being, Dasein is not simply extant or vorhanden or present at hand, like a stone, nor Dasein is determined by an alien purpose, or zuhanden, or ready to hand, like a hammer, which is what it is as something to hammer with, and which only man can handle. In contradistinction from these two other ways of being, which are the merely extant or vorhanden, and the functional being or zuhanden, man, or Dasein, has the privilege of being in such a way that he is thrust upon himself and yet owns his own existence. And unlike all other beings, man is so constituted that through most of his actions, he stands in some awareness of his being, of that and how he is. This means that man, or Dasein, is conscious not only of the things around him, but also of his own existence. For this reason, almost all of man's act is an act in some awareness of the essence of being. In other words, for Heidegger, the awareness of one's being, that is, self-consciousness, is also at the same time an awareness of the essence of being, or essence of reality. In fact, Heidegger believes that man is so constituted that he is open not only for his own being or the character and meanings of his own existence, but also for the being of other human and non-human particular beings. Now, the idea that man, or Dasein, is open to the essence of being, that is, his own being and the being of other beings, gives way to the concept of openness as one of the conditions of the possibility of truly existing as a human being. But what is openness, and how does man make himself open to the essence of being? Heidegger understands openness as consciousness, but he avoids using the term not only because of its Cartesian implications, but because it prevents us from realizing that each individual lucidity or openness is part and parcel of a wide and general openness, of an elementary sort of truth. Thus, openness as consciousness simply refers to the manifestness of being or things. Thus, for Heidegger, this openness is an a priori condition for any so-called subject-object relationships. Thus, for Heidegger, no subject could refer itself to an object, no act of experiential knowledge about an object could take place, and no statement or judgment could be arrived at about an object if such prior statement of manifestness had not come about, embracing both subject and object. Now again, how does man make himself open to the essence of being? Well, first, we need to take note that for Heidegger, man, or Dasein, is gifted with understanding, mood, and speech. But for Heidegger, these gifts are not gifts from someone, say God. In fact, Heidegger hardly believes in God. Heidegger simply calls these gifts as existential givens. They were there the moment man was born. According to Heidegger, In and through these existential givens, man discloses or illuminates himself. This is because with these existential givens, man, or Dasein, can understand, feel, and articulate. Hence, through these existential givens, openness is brought into the fore, and man, or Dasein, is able to understand himself and the things around him. Lastly, with openness, it is therefore possible for man, or Dasein, to become truly himself, to truly exist as a human being. In addition to openness, Heidegger introduced the concept of world as another important condition of the possibility of truly existing as a human being. For Heidegger, world refers to that which constitutes the unity of significances, that is, the context of meanings in which man moves. Thus, world for Heidegger is not a blind mass of things or the totality of nature, but an existential structure that defines or constitutes man's way of being. Put simply, world for Heidegger could refer to a socio-cultural context upon which man draws meaning or that which shapes one's behavior. For example, consider the phrase, "the German's way of doing things," or "the American's way of doing things." For sure, the Germans or the Americans have their specific way of doing things because they have been defined by their own context. Hence, it is unnatural for the Germans to do the Americans' way of doing things because it's outside of their context. For Heidegger, man refers to this context of intersubjective meanings because he is always already within and amidst beings, and moves around them with ease and familiarity. Thus, for Heidegger, it is in and through the world that man projects and charts his own life for pragmatic reasons, but does so within this context of meanings and always guided by it. In this sense, we can infer that man is determined by world, and therefore, on this ground alone, it is quite wrong to assert that Heidegger has conceived of a man as sovereign or self-creator. Now, the two notions of openness and world constitute man as an entity that stands in an intimate and immediate awareness of being in its character and meanings. Only when openness and world occur can all that is, or the essence of being, and particular beings or ontic be encountered as beings. It is only through openness and world, therefore, that the unconcealment of being becomes possible. And so, we learn that through openness and world, man can gain a high degree of understanding of itself and the things around him, and thereby experience his true being, that of others, and of his things. However, man, in his everyday life, fails to realize that his mood, understanding, and speech are necessary ways of being. This is due to the fact that man's thrownness into the world implies deliverance or fallenness. Man's failure to realize that his mood, understanding, and speech are necessary ways of being suggests that man is lost in the world. For Heidegger, this lostness or fallenness in the world means that it is now the world that prescribes the path for man of which he succumbed or surrendered his creative abilities to worldly things. This exactly characterizes Heidegger's notion of inauthenticity or an inauthentic or meaningless existence. Hence, inauthenticity for Heidegger means being not free because we let others or Dasein decide for ourselves. Indeed, inauthenticity means not owning one's own existence. Now, for man or Dasein to be authentic, therefore, it has to own its existence again, that it has to regain its existence that is lost in the they. And for Heidegger, this implies that Dasein has to gain somehow full awareness of the significance of what it means to be, of what it means to be a self with others and objects in the world. If inauthenticity is understood as the fallenness of Dasein into the world, and if authenticity means full awareness of what it means to be a self with others and objects in the world, then this implies a becoming or the realization of Dasein's possibilities. For Heidegger, such realization of Dasein's possibilities occurs through the experience of angst, which mobilizes other key categories such as death, conscience, and decidedness. Heidegger understands angst as the authentic sensibility that discloses Dasein's finite existence in the world. This disclosure allows Dasein to understand itself as a finite being thrown toward its own most possibility, which is death. Through death, understood as the paradoxical possibility of no longer being able to be there, Dasein is thrown back to its own resources. This movement then discloses Dasein as an individual self thrown into the world, whose task in the world is to exist as itself, that is to say, to be authentic. For Heidegger, therefore, death is the ultimate basis of authenticity. For Heidegger, the categories of conscience and decidedness answer the question concerning the possibility of authentic existence. Heidegger understands conscience as the inner voice within Dasein itself that calls Dasein to come back to itself and seize the authentic possibility of truly being itself. Conscience appears to be an ought on the part of Dasein to own his existence again. Once Dasein heeds the call of conscience, decidedness ensues. Authenticity, therefore, as the full awareness of the significance of what it means to be a self, also means an awareness of one's own most possibilities and the firm resolve to realize them in the future. Authenticity is thus tied to one's possibilities and to possible future ways of being. For Heidegger, this makes manifest the temporal access to existential phenomenology. Dasein is in the present, indebted to the past, and oriented toward the future, or death. Indeed, the threefold structure of care turns out to be also the structure of existence. The human being is a being in time. However, for Heidegger, authenticity requires a kind of mood, understanding, and speech that are attuned to the essence of being, and this is possible in the thinking of the philosopher. And man, as Dasein and as thinker, will realize that his thinking is a way of being, that the essence of being unfolds in it, and that he is therefore a necessary instrument, that he is needed for the articulation of the essence of being. Heidegger, however, believes that Aristotle and the philosophers after him failed to think about the essence of being because they had only articulated the meaning of particular beings. Because of this, Heidegger believes philosophers hitherto could not realize themselves as Dasein, as authentic beings. This is precisely the reason why Heidegger calls for a second beginning of philosophy. And for Heidegger, this is the new task of philosophy: to think of being holistically. But what is the character of this new philosophizing? Well, Heidegger calls this Andenken, which means a thinking toward and of, and in this sense, a remembering kind of thinking. Remembering because the moment being reveals itself, it automatically withdraws itself. But toward what and of what? In other words, what is the subject matter of this kind of thinking? According to Heidegger, man should think toward and of the essence of being and of the essence of man. This is what we meant attuning oneself to being. And as we already know, it is only when we attuned ourselves to being that we become ready of the unconcealment of being and our eventual appropriation of that which is unconcealed by being. As Heidegger formulates it, being commands and directs the thinker, or being claims the thinking of the thinker so that it thereby may conceal itself in its truth. This is what Heidegger calls essential or meditative thinking, as opposed to calculative or scientific thinking. On a final note, it must be remembered that Heidegger did not pretend to have solved the problem of being. Toward the end of his magnum opus, Being and Time, Heidegger says explicitly that its only purpose is to rekindle the question of being and to bring into motion what has become stalemated. In fact, Heidegger concludes this work not with ready-made answers, but with a series of open questions. Alright, that's it for today. Keep looking forward to our series of daily whiteboard editions as we try to make the learning and understanding of philosophy incredibly easy. Thanks for joining us today in this edition of our daily whiteboard here at PHILO-notes. Full transcript of this video is available at philonotes.com. To keep you updated of our daily whiteboard editions here at PHILO-notes, just click here and subscribe. Until then, thanks, take care.